Miss Mary Reporting. The true story of sports writer Mary Garber, written by Sue Macy and illustrated by C.F. Payne. Mary Garber was a tiny bit of a girl, but that didn't stop her from playing football with the boys, tackle football, over rough and rocky ground. She called her team the Buena Vista Devils, or the BVDs. And of course, she was the quarterback. It seemed that Mary was born loving sports. Her younger sister, Neely, thought their father helped to feed Mary's interest. Not having a son, he'd take us to football games and other things, she said. As they watched, he taught his daughters the rules. He felt if you were a spectator, you ought to know what you were spectating, Neely said. When she wasn't playing or watching sports, Mary was reading all she could about them. She followed boxing and baseball and loved the football team from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. But Mary's mother wasn't as patient with her sports-loving daughter as her husband was. Neely said Mrs. Garber believed that a girl ought to behave like a girl. Not that Mary's behavior surprised her mom. She was used to her middle daughter's independent streak. When Mary was 8 years old, her family moved from New Jersey to North Carolina. Mrs. Garber insisted that her 3 girls write letters to their grandparents back in the Garden State. Mary's older sister Helen did as she was told. So did Neely. But Mary thought letters were boring. So she created a newspaper. In the Garber News, Mary reported all the news and drama from her neighborhood just outside of Winston-Salem. School was closed for the summer. Neely stepped on a tack. The BVDs won another game. The family poodle was run over by a car, but escaped injury by crouching in a rut in the bumpy road. Writing the Garber News came naturally to Mary. Early on, she set her sights on a career as a newspaper reporter. But opportunities were scarce when she graduated from college. She finally took a job as a society reporter for the Twin Cities Sentinel, a paper in Winston-Salem. Society reporters wrote about parties and other social events. They had to describe the glamorous clothing people wore. That was not at all Mary's cup of tea. At one dance, Mary remembered, I got the wrong dress on the wrong lady. After that, she brought along a friend who worked at a clothing store to help. Mary got her big break when the United States entered World War II. Many of the nation's young men joined the armed forces, leaving women to take over their jobs on the home front. After the Sentinel's last sports writer joined the Navy in 1944, the editor put Mary in charge. She kept the sports pages filled until the war was over. It wasn't easy, especially at the beginning. When Mary went to cover her first college football game, she found that there were no programs identifying the players. How could she describe the action if she didn't know who was making the plays? I was desperate, she later remembered. I didn't know what I was going to do. Fortunately, a spectator saw her helpless expression and volunteered to sit with her and tell her who was who. I couldn't have done it if it hadn't been for him, she said. He really saved my skin. World War II came to an end, and Mary's boss moved her to the news desk. But a year later, she went back to sports for good, just in time to witness an important milestone in baseball. In 1947, the Brooklyn Dodgers added infielder Jackie Robinson to their roster. Back then, African American athletes like Jackie played baseball in the segregated Negro leagues. When he joined the Dodgers, Jackie became the first black player in the major leagues since the 1880s. In August 1947, Mary traveled to Brooklyn, New York to watch the first-place Dodgers play 3 games against the Boston Braves. She was particularly impressed by Jackie's skill at bunting, tapping the ball lightly, for a base hit. Last Wednesday, he laid down a perfect bunt along the third baseline, she told her readers. And when Boston pitcher Johnny Sane threw wild to first, Robinson legged it all the way around to third. Jackie became a role model for Mary. She was inspired by his quiet dignity in the face of taunts and jeers from people who couldn't accept a black man in the major leagues. There's no getting around the fact that Robinson met these challenging days with maturity and courage, she would write in 1956. It takes guts to keep your mouth shut and walk away. It is against every normal reaction of human behavior, but Robinson did it. Mary had to endure her own share of slights and struggles. The trouble started in the press box, the area of a stadium or arena where reporters watch sports events. In the 1940s, women were banned from the press box at college football games. Mary was forced to sit with the coaches' wives until her editor complained. Even after she was allowed in, Mary had to wear the football writer's official press badge, which proclaimed, "Press box, women and children not admitted." Locker rooms posed another problem. After a game, male reporters headed into the team's locker room to interview players while they were changing into their street clothes. But Mary had to wait outside. By the time the players came out to talk to her, the male reporters had rushed back to write their stories. The players wanted to go home, making it hard for Mary to get good quotes. A few skipped out on her altogether. Sometimes, being a female sports reporter brought unusual requests. For example, a high school basketball coach once asked Mary to sew up a tear in a young man's uniform. Although she was far from a whiz with a needle and thread, Mary agreed to give it a try. "I nearly died during that game," she said, "because every time that kid went up for a rebound, I thought, oh gosh, those pants are going to rip and his pants are going to fall down and I'm going to be really embarrassed." But I'm proud to say that they held. Mary did her job with steady determination. Soon readers looked forward to her bylines. Coaches started to know her and respect her, and young athletes were eager to talk to her. When Mary started working for the Sentinel, many schools in the South were segregated. White children went to all white schools, and black children went to all black schools. The newspaper rarely covered games at Winston-Salem's all-black schools, but Mary changed that. "It seemed to me that black parents were as interested in what their kids were doing as white parents were," she said. Before long, black athletes were watching for her, hoping she would show up to write about their games. Mary showed up for more than 50 years. She wrote about baseball, football, basketball, tennis, track and field, and just about every other competitive contest, including marbles. She officially retired in 1986 at age 70. But after that, she kept coming to work every day and writing at least 3 articles a week. By the time Mary gave up this daily grind in 2002, people realized what an extraordinary career she'd had. She won awards and was voted into the Sports Writers Hall of Fame. These honors were part of Mary's legacy as a sports writer, but so were her encounters with people she'd written about years before. Time after time, these adults showed Mary folded, yellowed newspaper clips with her byline that they'd been carrying around in their wallets for decades. Mary understood why her reporting had a lasting impact. "I tried whenever I wrote about kids to be as positive as I could," she said. "If you can give a kid a pat on the back, or if you can tell him he's done well, or you can make him believe in himself, you can make a difference in his life." Mary also made a difference in the lives of the women who followed in her footsteps. Ashley McGeechee-Fox, who covers the National Football League for ESPN.com, was an 8-year-old tennis player in Winston-Salem when Mary wrote an article about her. Years later, Mary was her role model as Ashley pursued her own career as a sports writer. Ashley said, I remember thinking, if this petite lady in granny glasses can stand up to an angry coach, why can't I? According to Mary, the greatest compliment she ever got came from a young boy. It happened in the 1950s when Mary was covering the Soapbox Derby in Winston-Salem. A friend of hers who was sitting in the stands overheard a conversation between two African American boys about 8 and 10 years old. The older boy pointed to Mary and asked, "You see that lady down there on the field?" The second boy nodded. "That's Miss Mary Garber, and she doesn't care who you are, or where you're from, or what you are. If you do something, she's going to write about you." Author's note. Mary Garber didn't set out to change the world, but change it she did. By reporting on athletic events at black high schools and colleges, she helped bring equality to the sports sections of mainstream Southern newspapers, and by extension, to the newspapers themselves. And merely by doing her job, she jump-started the efforts of female sports reporters to gain equal footing with males. Mary often gave credit to her sister, Neely, for making it possible for her to live her dream. Mary resided with Neely in their childhood home until the last year of her life. Neely kept things running on the home front after their father died in the 1950s and their mother in the 1980s. Newspapers were in their heyday when Mary was covering sports. She started decades before the internet made instantaneous scores and highlights available, as they are today. Fans might find some local sports news on the radio or TV, but they depended on their hometown papers for write-ups of every local contest, along with photographs and athlete profiles. Despite retiring when she was 70, Mary continued to write for the Winston-Salem Journal regularly until she was 86 years old. She stopped only when her eyesight and hearing began to fail, but sports were the center of her life right to the end. During her final months, a minister asked Mary what she hoped would be her spiritual reward in heaven. She immediately had an answer: football season.